there's a case before the Supreme Court that's going to be argued this term about this concept called the independent state legislator doctrine. And the case arises out of North Carolina. It's actually about gerrymandering, not about sort of access to the polls directly. And what happened in North Carolina was that the North Carolina legislature gerrymandered very dramatically their congressional districts, such that even though the state is pretty divided equally on partisan lines, the Republicans would control the vast majority of congressional seats. And the United States Supreme Court had previously held that the federal courts were not going to be able to intervene in those kinds of disputes, calling them non-justiciable. But they said, state courts, this is an area where you can go to state court. And the North Carolina Supreme Court took up that mantle and held that under the North Carolina Constitution, this kind of partisan gerrymandering was unconstitutional, and the court required the state legislature to redraw the lines so that they would be pretty fair, so that they would reflect the partisan divide in the country. There is a very radical notion now that some plaintiffs in that case are pushing, representing the legislature, that, well, actually, notwithstanding what the US Supreme Court said previously about the role of state courts here, state courts have no role to play in this kind of a case, because under the elections clause in the Constitution, the power to decide the time and manner of holding federal elections belongs to the state legislature, with potentially some oversight role from Congress in some of the laws that Michael talked about at the beginning, but there's no rule for state courts. That is a radical doctrine that is not consistent with the text of the Constitution. It's not consistent with historical understanding, but it does clearly have the appeal to at least some of the conservative justices. What we are doing, we are, I don't want to say too much about that, because we're sort of actively in the process, a number of organizations of working on this case, and there will be a number of briefs filed to point out just how inconsistent this would be with constitutional traditions and really with the idea of democracy. You can't have a court sort of say that one branch and only one branch of the state government gets to make all these decisions, especially because that same court has allowed that branch of the state government, the state legislature, to be so gerrymandered that actually it does not represent a majority of the people. So it's not really a democratic institution. So we are going to push back, and we were going to do our very best to show the court that this would just be a bridge too far, and it would be a fundamentally illegitimate decision. It is a very, very important case, and one that we will be watching very closely.
The notion that only state legislatures get the power in our system under our Constitution over elections, with no checks and balances from state constitutions and state courts, from state governors signing and vetoing bills, from voters passing ballot initiatives like the ballot initiative that was passed in Florida with 64% of the vote, that only the state legislators get to, is without any foundation. James Madison insisted on putting the provision in the Constitution that this relates to, because he knew that state legislatures would be engaged, as he said in his notes, in abuses, and that they would pass laws designed to make it so their own faction would win. He knew they explicitly did this to stop gerrymandering and to stop voter suppression. They didn't call it that in those days, of course. No Supreme Court ruling has ever found this. In fact, the court has ruled against this over and over again. It would cause chaos. And as you say, at least 4 of the current justices are ISLT curious at the very least. There was a brief filed in the case last week that is pretty substantial and pretty significant. You might have seen that former federal judge Michael Ludig, who testified before the January 6th committee, very esteemed conservative judge. He said that the independent state legislature theory was an attempt to steal the next election. There was a brief last week in the case that I hope and think may be a game changer. It came in from the Conference of Chief Justices of the state Supreme Courts in all 50 states across the United States, Republicans and Democrats alike. It purported to say, we don't take a position, these briefs come in, some of them are for one side, others are for the other side. This one says it doesn't take a position on which side it's on. It says we don't take a position, but the independent state legislature theory is a grave threat to American democracy and would be a complete catastrophe if you did it. because among other things, it would take away the state court's ability to enforce the right to vote. You asked early on, is there a right to vote in the US Constitution? I have a somewhat different view on this. It's mentioned 5 times in the US Constitution, just always in the amendments. And of course, when the Constitution was first written, there was slavery, women could not vote. Only white men who owned property could vote. But we have referenced the right to vote over and over and over again in the US Constitution. We need courts and among others to enforce that right. But in all but one of the 50 states, there is a much more explicit right to vote in state constitutions than there is in the US Constitution. And one of the things that this Moore versus Harper case would do is choke off the ability of state courts to enforce that right to vote in federal elections. It would be Citizens United times Shelby County on steroids in its impact on American democracy if it goes the wrong way.